not even open. It's legitimately not even open.
reminder of our main stories. Israel says it's carried out airstrikes against the Syrian army after rockets were fired into the Golan Heights. Meanwhile, a standoff is continuing in Jerusalem, where hundreds of Palestinians have barricaded themselves inside the Al-Aqsa Mosque. More than 100,000 people in Quebec, in Canada, are still without electricity 4 days after the power network was crippled by an ice storm. Now to the Philippines. An indigenous tattooist has become Vogue's oldest ever cover star. She is 106. Apo Wang-od is a Mamba Batok, a traditional tattooist in the Philippines. And the editor of Vogue Philippines, Bea Valdez, says she represents some of the ideals of Filipino culture. I spoke to Bea earlier, asked her to tell me more about the magazine's choice of cover star.
What happened was Vogue Philippines is actually relatively new. One of the things that was very important was the fact that Vogue has wanted to lead with Vogue's values, which are inclusivity, diversity, sustainability, and respect for the natural environment, and always celebrating sort of craft and creativity. We also wanted to lead through our Filipino values, which were bayanihan, which is being a hero for others, malasakit, which is deep empathy and optimism. So in our very first meeting, we talked a lot about the Filipino identity and what this means. And so when we came upon the idea of a beauty issue, it was a unanimous decision by the whole team that Apo Wang-od symbolizes this for the Filipino culture.
And the world's reaction has been what?
It has been phenomenal. I think there's something that just resonates so deeply. It's whether they can see her spirit in the image or just someone who has had a very, how shall we say it, a very good working relationship with time. So
that's a very good way of putting it when you consider she's 106 years old.
Exactly. But even that, you know, when we first were talking about her, it wasn't even about her age. It was really more about, I suppose, a sense of wisdom and even her continual sense of curiosity, I think, which was really appealing to us.
Tell us a bit more about the skills that she has and how she uses them, and also the growing rarity of these skills, which I believe is now turning because of what she does.
Yeah. The art is called Mamwa Watok. It's a 1,000-year-old practice of tattooing using the hand tapping technique. And this is where they get a pomelo thorn and it's dipped in soot. And then this is sort of tapped into the skin with the designs. And at the time when she learned, she was the first and only female Wamawatok artist. But since then, she has taught two of her grandnieces. This is Grace Palicas and Eliang Wigan. We spoke to Grace a few days ago. She says maybe there's 90, almost 100 tattoo artists now who are trying to keep the craft alive.
Because people now from far and wide will go to this really quite obscure region, won't they, to have this kind of tattoo done on them?
Yes, absolutely. It started off with traditional meanings. Like for the men, it would signify that they were warriors. And for women, it was a sign of fertility or as beauty markings. And again, when we were speaking to Grace, she said the idea was that it was mana, which when you translate it in the language, it means inheritance. Because they said when they die, they can't take the beads that they wear or the clothes that they wear, but the tattoos will remain on their skin forever.
And I described the location where she lives as obscure. I mean, reading the story that appears in Vogue Philippines, I mean, actually getting there to see her is quite a task, isn't it?
Yes, it is. I mean, it's up in the mountains. It's a 12-hour drive. And I believe the writer Audrey Carpio said that it would take a relatively fit person 40 minutes to trek up. And our producer said that it would take him an hour and 40 minutes to trek up. So it's completely dependent on the kind of journey you're willing to take.
Do we know what her reaction is to all the publicity?
Yes, we do, actually. It was quite wonderful to speak to Grace and just find out Wang-od's thoughts. She said that Wang-od has actually been on the cover of multiple magazines, and she's had numerous features, but she said that this one was special. She also said that there have been a couple of people already who have made the trek with the magazine, asking her to autograph the cover. What I did love most is when we were speaking to Grace. She said when she saw the cover, she said, "Oh, my Lola is so beautiful on that cover." Lola means grandmother. And she said it was a really good gift for 2023.
The editor of Vogue Philippines, Bea Valdez, talking about her decision to put 106-year-old Apo Wangod on the front of her magazine. We've talked about some fairly serious, heavy stuff, Simon, this morning so far. It's good to hear something a little more uplifting.
It is, and I think it's probably an example of the way Vogue has definitely expanded its, around the world in its different editions, has expanded its view of what a cover person could be over the last few years. I've noticed that.
And also that growing inclination amongst not just Vogue magazine, but plenty of others as well, to tell the stories of people like Apo Wangod.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of quite a few of the British Vogue covers, I think, since Edward Enninful took over as editor of British Vogue. And I was just looking at the image, actually. It's absolutely beautiful. I mean, it's such a striking photo. In itself, it's a great piece of photographic portraiture, and she looks incredible. And I think it just kind of, it hits on all these very important notes that are kind of defining our age at the moment in terms of efforts to not just about inclusivity, but sustainability and the preservation of cultures that are being sadly kind of eclipsed by, or they're just kind of coming close to being extinct.
Are you conscious of that more, Reuters, Simon, that need to go beyond the obvious stories and tell the ones that are down, remote, difficult perhaps, but still important?
Yeah, I think we pride ourselves on the fact we've always kind of covered the world and had correspondents and reporters around the world. We operate in more than 150 countries. But I think there is a real desire from readers and viewers for kind of personal stories, much more maybe so than 20 years ago. And younger news consumers really, really relate more, I think, to these kind of stories. And there's also a real desire for authenticity, I think, which also comes out in this.
I was going to say, you couldn't be much more authenticity than that front page you were just describing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a very key word. That's authenticity, definitely. It's driving a lot of our content as well.
More to come from my guests, Simon Robinson and Golar Motovali, in our final hour. You're with Weekend from the BBC World Service. The latest news is next.
Do you have an old car, RV, or boat taking up space in your driveway? Well, you could trade it in to one of the local dealerships, or you can donate it to KUNR. We'll bring you more hours of great radio programs and news with proceeds from your vehicle. Either way, you're supporting a local business. Donating a vehicle to KUNR is free and easy. You can reach us by phone at 888-586-7404 or go to kunr.careasy.org to schedule a pickup time that works best for you. You could also head to our website to find more information about the car donation program. It's kunr.org. This is KUNR Reno and KNCC Elko.
BBC World Service, it's 7 hours GMT. Welcome to Weekend with Julian Warwicker. Israel says it's carried out airstrikes against the Syrian army after rockets were fired into the Golan Heights. Meanwhile, a standoff is continuing in Jerusalem, where hundreds of Palestinians have barricaded themselves inside the Al-Aqsa Mosque. We remember Ben Ferrage, the last surviving Nuremberg trials prosecutor, who's died at 103.
22 defendants, each one charged of mass murder. All of them pleaded not guilty. No one ever showed any sign of remorse whatsoever. But these men wrote the darkest page in human history.
Plus, the enduring appeal of Star Wars.
One thing that amazes me is how many people of a certain age who saw the films way back in the originals get emotionally affected by meeting people from the movies.
That's all here on Weekend After the World News.
Hello, I'm David Harper with the BBC News. Israel says it has carried out airstrikes in response to rocket fire into the occupied Golan Heights. It says it hit a Syrian army compound as well as radar and artillery positions. Yolande Knell is in Jerusalem.
In a total of 6 rockets launched at the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights overnight, 2 salvos of them. Now, they didn't all reach Israeli-controlled territory, and those that did were intercepted or landed in open areas. But Israel has been responding very quickly with artillery fire and also by attacking Syrian military targets, it says. Inside Syria, we've got reports of explosions close to Damascus from Syrian state television. It just shows how there is this risk of tensions escalating further across the region.
Tensions remain high in Jerusalem as hundreds of Palestinians have barricaded themselves inside the Al-Aqsa Mosque while Jewish worshippers are converging on the Western Wall for the Passover blessing. Reports from Yemen say Saudi and Omani delegations are in the capital Sana'a to hold talks with the leaders of the rebel Houthi movement as part of international efforts to end the country's long conflict. Discussions are expected to focus on the terms of a permanent ceasefire. More than 100,000 people in the Canadian province of Quebec are still without electricity 4 days after an ice storm caused severe disruption to the power grid. The worst-hit areas include the city of Montreal. A local journalist, Anne-Marie Provost, described the conditions there.
It's quite cold outside in Montreal right now. It's around 0 degrees, maybe a little bit higher than 0 degrees. So when you don't have electricity, well, you don't have heating. So the temperature in the houses and in the apartments are getting quite low, and you're losing food. So they had to open emergency shelters so people, they can go there and have a little heat. They can take a shower. They can recharge their electronic devices. But the morale is a bit low because you see like some streets, they are getting their power back, but then you don't get your power back. So people are asking why.
Pope Francis will celebrate Easter Mass on Sunday morning and pronounce the traditional To the City and the World blessing in St. Peter's Square. Our religion editor Alim Makboul reports from Rome.
Just a matter of days ago, there were doubts about whether Pope Francis would be well enough to take part in Holy Week events at all. But since he left hospital after a bout of bronchitis, he's managed to fulfill most of his commitments during the busiest time in the Vatican calendar. At times during the week, the popes looked tired and breathless, though at others much stronger. He's expected to lead Easter Sunday Mass and then to make his appearance on the main balcony of St. Peter's Basilica to deliver the Easter Sunday blessing before tens of thousands of people.
You're listening to the latest world news from the BBC. China is continuing its military drills near Taiwan, which are now in their second day. Chinese state media say the military are continuing their encirclement of the island and carrying out simulated precision strikes on key targets. The Taiwanese Defense Ministry said it had spotted 58 Chinese warplanes and 9 Navy vessels so far on Sunday. The drills began shortly after the Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen returned home from a trip to the United States. The commander of the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces has accused Turkey of trying to kill him with a drone strike. General Mazloum Abdi said the attack happened when he was at Suleymaniye airport in the Kurdish region of Iraq, and that his convoy included US military personnel. Turkey has denied any involvement in the attack, which caused a small fire but no casualties. Officials in Brazil say they've destroyed an aircraft on a clandestine runway in the Yanomami indigenous territory in the northern Amazon. 2 men were arrested for illegal gold mining. President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva has pledged to put an end to illegal gold mining, which causes environmental destruction and also threatens the lives of indigenous communities. Benjamin Ferencz, the last surviving prosecutor from the Nuremberg trials, has died. He was 103. Born to a Jewish family, Mr. Ferenc studied law at Harvard and during the Second World War collected evidence of Nazi war crimes. At Nuremberg, he led the case against SS death squads. In 2006, Mr. Ferenc told the BBC they left a considerable amount of evidence which led to many convictions.
They left a comprehensive daily report of how many Jews and others they had executed in every town. So we had the names of the commanding officers, the troops that were involved, these SS troops, the number of people they killed, and in what town.
He later focused on private practice, but left that to work for the establishment of an international criminal court. BBC News.
Six minutes past 7 GMT. Welcome to Weekend from the BBC World Service with me, Julia Morica. With me throughout the programme, Simon Robinson, Executive Editor at Reuters, and Golnar Motavalli of Bloomberg. She's head of Iran coverage there, having previously been based in Tehran. We begin this hour with the further unrest in the Middle East. In Jerusalem, hundreds of Palestinians have barricaded themselves inside the Al-Aqsa Mosque, raising fears of further clashes with Israeli police. Jordan, which manages the religious complex, has warned of catastrophic consequences if police storm the mosque, as they did earlier in the week. Then, separate to that, Israel says its warplanes have attacked Syrian military targets, including radar and artillery positions. Syrian state media has reported explosions near the capital, Damascus. Israel said it was responding to rocket fire from southern Syria into the Israeli-controlled Golan Heights. Well, earlier in the programme, I spoke to the BBC's correspondent in Jerusalem, Yolande Knell, first about those airstrikes.
A total of 6 rockets launched at the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights overnight, 2 sets of 3. They didn't all reach Israeli-controlled territory. Those that did were intercepted or they landed in open areas. And Israeli forces have said since that their warplanes have been attacking Syrian military targets. And we've had reports from Syrian state television of explosions close to Damascus, artillery fire being used across the Golan Heights as well. And we've got one report from Lebanese TV suggesting that Palestinian militant groups based in Syria are responsible, but Israel always says that it holds the Syrian authorities responsible for any hostile fire that is launched from their territory. Now, of course, this is all ratcheting up tensions regionally because we see that just in recent days, Israel has also come under fire from the south of Lebanon, also from the Gaza Strip with rockets. Actually, the biggest barrage of rockets fired from southern Lebanon into Israel since the 2006 Lebanon war just last week. Now, that has prompted it to retaliate. It's blamed Palestinian militants for that rocket fire, Hamas, as well as Hamas firing rockets from Gaza. So this all came about really after last week's violent scenes at Al-Aqsa Mosque when it was raided by Israeli police officers, prompting a regional outcry.
And just bring us up to date on events at the Al-Aqsa as we speak.
Yeah, I mean, it's still very tense in Jerusalem, where, of course, to remind people, you've got, the Ramadan holiday overlapping with Passover and Easter. We heard that there were hundreds of Palestinian worshippers who had remained in the mosque overnight. This ahead of a big day at the Western Wall just below, which is, of course, the holiest site where Jews can pray, although the Al-Aqsa Mosque, Haram al-Sharif, as it's known to Muslims, is the third holiest site in Islam. It's also the holiest place in Judaism. And there was an expectation there could be another Israeli police raid to try to clear the site this morning. That's why lots of people stayed there. Now, so far, we're not seeing any repetition of those violent scenes from last week, but at dawn you could see young Palestinian men were being forced to pray outside the old city gates. Israeli police were not allowing them to enter to get to the Al-Aqsa Mosque. It's not clear how many people remain inside the mosque now, but it's a big day in the old city because you've got both this priestly blessing at the Western Wall. Of course, it's Easter Sunday for Palestinian Christians and international visitors as well. There are so many of them when I've been down to the old city, sort of packing the streets. And another development, this afternoon, we've got the funeral taking place for 2 British Israeli sisters who were killed in a shooting attack in the north of the occupied West Bank on Friday, which also seriously wounded their mother. She's still in hospital. So that funeral will be taking place in the settlement close to where they lived.
Yolande Knell in Jerusalem. The last surviving prosecutor of the Nuremberg trials, Benjamin Ferenc, has died at the age of 103. One of the cases he was assigned to prosecute was the notorious Einsatzgruppen case, which has been called the biggest murder trial in history. All 22 of the defendants were Nazis and included 6 generals. They were convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Well, here is Benjamin Ferenc himself speaking to the BBC's Hard Talk programme. This was back in 2017.
22 defendants, each one charged of mass murder. All of them pleaded not guilty. No one ever showed any sign of remorse whatsoever. But these men wrote the darkest page in human history. People were murdered because they didn't share the race, the color, and the ideology of their executioners. I thought it was horrible then. I think it's horrible now. And I appealed for a rule of law which would, in future, protect people from what they were considered.
Well, Professor Philippe Sands is a leading international human rights lawyer and has been a panel guest on this programme over the years. Philippe, welcome. Good morning.
Yeah, lovely to be with you.
What is so striking about this story is that when he secured those convictions, he was 27 years old.
He was a remarkable individual. I mean, it feels like such a privilege to have known him. He was one of those human beings who just makes you feel life is special. He was dealing with terrible horrors and terrible atrocities, and yet he managed to develop a sense of purpose. Even, as you say, as a very young man, he had a very clear vision of where he wanted to go, and he devoted really the rest of his life to that idea of a rule of law in international relations, that no one is above the law and justice must be done. It was an incredibly inspiring character.
Because when he did secure those convictions, not only was he 27 years old, but I mean, he had limited legal experience, didn't he?
He did. He was, fresh and young, but had full of energy. And I think that's one of the things that we know in life. I mean, I know it from the cases that I'm involved in today, that very often it's the younger lawyers on a team who come up with the most innovative and interesting ideas. I mean, he was one of those people. He was already sort of well-trained, got a good law degree, he had ideas, he worked hard, and he was persistent. He knew exactly where he was going to go. That was, I think, what really characterized him, even at that young age. And that's not actually so rare. Many of the younger lawyers, they already have that characteristic. You can tell quite early those kinds of people.
His role at Nuremberg, how much was it shaped by his own experience during World War II?
Well, I think he came to America as a very young child, and so he grew up in America, and America was his life, but he would have heard stories from his parents about what was happening in Europe. He then fought in the war, he was a soldier, and then got involved in these legal investigations and factual investigations. He wasn't counsel in the famous main international military tribunal trial. There was a series of successor trials before the US military tribunals, and he took the lead role in one of those trials, as you've described, the Einsatzgruppen trials. But he built on the experience. What had happened 45-46 was you'd had this big famous trial with Goering and Hess and all these other characters. And then there were the follow-up trials. So again, coming back to his age, he knew about that. He'd been in touch with the prosecutors. He worked with a guy called Telford Taylor, who had really been one of the principal prosecutors for the main trial. And so he had a combination already as a young man of experience, of ideas, and a very clear personal sense of where he wanted to take this. And of course, what he achieved was the creation of the modern system of international criminal justice, such as it is.
That was where I was about to go in this conversation, because having done what he did at Nuremberg, that sense that there needs to be some kind of internationally orientated justice was so alive in his mind, wasn't it?
It was, and he was one of those go-to people. I mean, I don't know when I first encountered him, but I've been in touch with him for more than 25 years, and it goes all the way back to Yugoslavia and Rwanda and the creation of the International Criminal Court in 1998. He was a point of reference. He was a point of connection with that incredible moment in 1945 when the world changed on its axis and developed these ideas of individual accountability for wrongdoing. And so you would go to him and you'd speak to him because he was there in 45. He knew the characters, and it gave you strength and energy in relation to things that are going on today. I mean, I had my recent contact with him just a few months ago in relation to Russia and Ukraine, and he had very, very clear views built on his Nuremberg experience of wanting justice in relation to what he considered to be the crime of aggression in Ukraine. So he had a burning passion. I mean, it's one of these people who just had a deep energy, and it permeated others and infused, the energy of others. It was a remarkable human being.
That's perhaps a good moment for me to bring my guest in, who've been listening to you very closely. Philippe Gonard, what's on your mind as you listen to Philippe's hands?
Well, I've just been just thinking about recent efforts to indict both members of the Syrian government of Bashar al-Assad and more recently Russia as well, Russian officials. But also this idea that I've been thinking about the ICC and how the International Criminal Court and the extent to which it's actually effective. And I'd be fascinated to hear what Philippe thinks about that, because Ferenc was so obviously so crucial to the establishment of that institution, and the fact that it remains very difficult to prosecute people accused of war crimes internationally.
Philippe, as you say, it was established, but I wonder if Ben Ferenc was frustrated by its limitations.
He was a realist. He would always say, and I think others have, including myself, have picked this up from him, justice is a long game. I mean, it was remarkable to speak to him. I remember getting in touch with him a few years ago. I was writing a book, East-West Street, and I was writing about a guy called Raphael Lemkin, the man who invented the concept of genocide in 1944-45. So I called up Ben Ferenc and said, did you ever meet Lemkin? He said, yeah, of course. He was an absolute pain in the ass. He would, we were trying to prosecute these Einsatzgruppen people, and this guy would turn up and, he would bother us with his concept of genocide and irritate us. And of course, we knew he was doing the right thing, but we just wanted to focus on war crimes and crimes against humanity. He had a warm sense of humor. He was a realist. He was frustrated, Donna. He did feel at times things went too slowly and more could be done and there wasn't political will. But at the end of the day, he understood when you adopt a revolutionary moment of which he was a part in 45, the world isn't going to change overnight, and you've just got to go in for the long haul.
Simon.
Yeah, I'm interested in your thoughts on what the ICC is doing in Ukraine. We've seen groups from the ICC there looking at various points in the country, including Bucha, which is in just north of Kyiv, or on the outskirts really of the capital, where there are alleged war crimes. Is it normal that in the middle of a conflict like this, it seems almost like in the past things happened after the fact, but now we're kind of seeing it in real time?
This is a really new development. You're absolutely right to focus on that. I mean, as you know, the system of international rules basically says it's first and foremost for national jurisdictions, national courts to proceed. And Ukraine is looking, obviously, has a very extensive effort. The International Criminal Court then comes in to support international efforts. And because there are so many horrors reportedly going on, of course, the ICC has also its work cut out. But this is different from any conflict that I remember for precisely the point that you're mentioning, from literally day one, on the crime of aggression, which the ICC doesn't have jurisdiction on, but on war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the allegations of genocide too, the ICC does have jurisdiction, and it's been involved from literally day one. And part of the reason for that, I think there are two reasons for that. Firstly, a lot of the people in the upper echelons of the Ukrainian government are lawyers and international lawyers. The foreign minister, for example, Dmytro Kuleba, very deep experience in this. And secondly, the territory knows the horrors of these kinds of things. This is the place where crimes against humanity and genocide came into being in 1945. And so they've combined to put the rule of law, matters of justice and accountability at the very heart of the conflict.
Philip Sands, very good to have you on. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Philip Sands reflecting on the very long life of Ben Ferenc, last surviving Nuremberg prosecutor who has died at the age of 103. We got onto the subject of Russia-Ukraine inevitably in that conversation, and we're going to continue with that in the context of art theft in conflict zone. It's known as art napping. It's nothing new, but there is now evidence that it's happening in Ukraine, so much so that UNESCO, the United Nations Cultural Organization, is now training European nations in how to save art, which has been looted by Russia. Noah Charney is a professor of art history and is internationally recognized in the field of art crime, and he wrote a book about it, The Art Thief. When I spoke to him, he told me first about the scale of what Russia seems to be doing when it comes to important cultural artifacts in Ukraine.
Well, it seems from multiple eyewitness sources and from photographs and videos that there is a proactive and pre-planned attempt to loot cultural heritage objects from occupied territories in Ukraine. We have photographs of Russian soldiers in plain clothes loading these objects onto a truck, so it's quite overt what they're doing. And there is a historical precedent for this that makes me think that this is not an afterthought, but this was part of what was planned all along.
When you say an historic precedent, what are you thinking of here?
When I teach courses in this, I go back to 212 BC with the sacking of Syracusa in Sicily by the Roman Republican army that launched a craze for collecting Hellenistic art among Romans and led to the proactive looting of art from occupied territories by Roman armies. That was picked up by Napoleon. His army had a dedicated art theft unit. And the Nazis looked back to Napoleon in ancient Rome and they said, well, if they did it, then we can too. And they created the ERR, which was a special unit just for looting art. And when the Red Army was battling the Nazis, there was a proactive attempt on the part of the Soviets at that point to cull cultural heritage objects, and they called them trophy brigades. The trophy brigades of the Red Army were sent by Stalin to Germany to collect art that was in compensation and revenge for human and cultural losses inflicted by the Nazis to their country. There's a famous example called Priam's treasure, for instance, discovered at and illegally taken from Troy by the German archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann. It disappeared in 1945 from a protective bunker in Berlin where the Nazis had kept it, where it had been transferred from the Berlin State Museums. And then it reappeared in September of 1993 at the Pushkin Museum in Moscow. So I have a feeling that Putin may be trying to reenact these trophy brigades of the Red Army.
This isn't necessarily, is it, about financial gain when it happens? It's often about an attempt to almost erase a culture if you are at war with a particular country at any given moment.
That's exactly true, and there's a multi-part rationalization for the looting of art in war. We have this claims from Putin that Ukrainian national identity is fiction, that Ukraine lacked this, quote, real statehood, and that was part of Russians' own history, culture, and spiritual space, he said. If we look at this a bit more deeply, there's three parts to this rationalization, and it's not Putin alone. This has historically been the case. Number one is the implication that, this art is really ours to begin with. Number two, you're quote-unquote barbarians who can't appreciate the art, therefore you should not have it. And three, this is our rightful reparation for the damage you inflicted on us, even if we were the ones to invade you.
Where does international law, where do global conventions stand on all of this?
Well, there have been multiple conventions in the past, the Hague Convention, UNESCO conventions, and the idea is that cultural heritage objects should be remote from human conflict. There are going to be wars, that's a given, but these cultural treasures, which are humanity's treasures, should not be involved. They should be protected at all costs. Of course, conventions are made, but they're often broken either in the heat of combat or proactively through decision-making on the part of those involved.
Presumably, it's when these items cross borders that those who are perpetrating this kind of crime are potentially at their most vulnerable.
That is indeed the case. Getting an object out of a country, especially from a source country to a market country where you might want to try to sell it on an open market, black market, or gray market, that is tricky. But in a conflict, then these sort of peacetime laws really go out the window and anything goes.
I mean, I asked that question with UNESCO's plans in mind. International UN cultural body, of course, training European nations, some of Ukraine's neighbours, in how to save Ukrainian art looted by Russia. The idea being that if some of these items do cross out of Ukraine into a country that's supporting Ukraine, there might be something they can do about it.
That's always the hope, but the question is whether these are being wholly culled at state level, or if there's individual crimes of opportunity with Russian soldiers pocketing objects. If it's the latter, then there's a good chance that they might try to sell them, in which case it's quite dangerous for them, because if an object is put up for sale, it's like a submarine coming to the surface of the water. That's when it's vulnerable. That's when somebody might spot something. And then people who are in the art market need to know what to keep an eye out for.
You mentioned the Hague Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property. This dates back to 1954. Now, Russia signed that at the time, didn't they?
Russia did sign the Hague Convention, and at the time, a lot of it had to do with cruel and unusual punishment and trying to ban things like chemical warfare. But there was the cultural heritage element as well. The question is whether people are going to follow up on that and cleave to what they signed, given the sense that there's new people in power who are now ruling the country, not the people who signed originally. In practice, there isn't much that the world can do to enforce this, short of declaring war on someone who goes against one of these conventions. But, rules of a bare-knuckle fight when it comes to war, sometimes the rules go out the window, unfortunately.
That was Noah Charney, and as he hinted, Simon, there's nothing new about this.
Nothing new, no, indeed, and very interesting examples that he gave. A friend of mine wrote a book a couple of years ago called Loot, which is about the Benin bronzes, which are these incredible artifacts and artworks that Nigeria would very much like back. Many of them sit in the British Museum. And I also think of he mentioned the efforts the Nazis undertook to get a lot of artworks, and they in fact stored many of them in a really huge salt mine in Austria. And there was an Allied effort, and it later made into a movie about 10 years ago called The Monuments Men.
Yes.
A small military unit that went basically about trying to get many of these artworks back.
What comes to mind for you on this?
I mean, Iran obviously isn't a war zone or a conflict zone right now, but it actually reminds me of a story I read last week in The Observer about a fragment of very old, I think about 2,500-year-old relief from somewhere in southern Iran that was quite poorly sort of cut off and found at Stansted in the cargo of a plane at Stansted Airport earlier this month, and it's now in the British Museum. And it's this weird effort by people that no one has been able to identify to smuggle illegally this piece of very important history to the UK, and it's worth about £30 million, apparently, according to the British Museum, and it's absolutely extraordinary that it's still happening on that scale.
As Noah hints that the law is still playing catch up to a degree on all of this. You're with Weekend from the BBC World Service. The latest news headlines are next.
Distribution of the BBC World Service in the United States is made possible by American Public Media, producer and distributor of award-winning public radio content, engaging audiences, creating meaningful experiences, and fostering conversations. APM, American Public Media, with support from JLL, a leasing, management, investment, and technology company dedicated to creating a brighter future for the world of commercial real estate. JLL.com. See a brighter way.
KUNR's broadcasts are made possible by a generous grant from the E.L. Cord Foundation in memory of E.L. Cord, pioneer radio broadcaster.
7:30 GMT. This is Weekend from the BBC World Service. Still to come, 25 years after the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, which has brought peace to Northern Ireland. We reflect on the impact it's had and on the issues still to be resolved. Plus, you'll hear one of the most well-known voices from the Star Wars movies. That's all here on Weekend with me, Julian Warwicker, after a summary of world news.
BBC News with Chris Barrow. Israel says its warplanes have attacked Syrian military targets, including radar and artillery positions. Syrian state media has reported explosions near Damascus. Israel said it was responding to rocket fire into the Israeli-controlled Golan Heights. Tensions in Jerusalem remain high as hundreds of Palestinians have barricaded themselves inside the Al-Aqsa Mosque, while Jewish worshippers are converging on the Western Wall for the Passover blessing. Israeli police stopped Palestinian men from entering the compound, forcing them to pray outside the old city gates. Reports from Yemen say Saudi and Omani delegations are in the capital Sana'a to hold talks with leaders of the rebel Houthi movement as part of international efforts to end the country's long conflict. Discussions are expected to focus on the terms of a permanent ceasefire. More than 100,000 people in the Canadian province of Quebec are still without electricity 4 days after an ice storm caused severe disruption to the power grid. The worst-hit areas include the city of Montreal. China is holding a second day of large-scale military drills around the self-ruled island of Taiwan. Chinese state media say the military is practicing simulated precision strikes on key targets. A Ukrainian minister is visiting India today for the first direct talks between the two countries since Russia invaded Ukraine last year. Eminaja Parova, Kyiv's first deputy foreign minister, is expected to be in India for 4 days. Officials in Brazil say they've destroyed an aircraft on a clandestine runway in the Yanomami indigenous territory in the northern Amazon. 2 men were arrested for illegal gold mining. Pope Francis will celebrate Easter Mass shortly and pronounce the traditional Urbi et Orbi blessing in St. Peter's Square, where tens of thousands of Catholics are expected to gather. BBC News.
You're listening to the BBC World Service. I'm Julian Warwicker with Weekend. With me throughout the programme, Simon Robinson, Executive Editor at Reuters, and Golnar Motavalli of Bloomberg, where she is Head of Iran Coverage. Now, they were known as the Troubles, and for 30 years the conflict in Northern Ireland saw communities pitted against each other, resulting in violence and death. On one side were the Unionists who wanted to remain part of the United Kingdom. They were mostly Protestants. And on the other side were the mostly Catholic nationalists who wanted to join an independent Ireland. That cause was taken up by the IRA, an armed group behind a bombing campaign against the British government. Here's a reminder of 2 of their major attacks, one in Brighton in 1984, and then there was another in Omagh in Northern Ireland in 1998.
In a split second in the early hours of Friday, October the 12th, 1984, the IRA have achieved their most daring strike on the British mainland.
Good evening. 4 people are dead and dozens injured after the bomb at the Conservative Party hotel in Brighton. But the IRA failed in what they set out to do. They were trying to murder the Prime Minister and most of the British cabinet as they slept. But Mrs. Thatcher escaped death by minutes.
You hear about these atrocities, these bombs. You don't expect them to happen to you. But life must go on as usual.
And your conference will go on.
The conference will go on. The conference, all right, John, the conference will go on as usual.
A massive car bomb in Northern Ireland has killed more than 20 people, including children. It exploded in a busy shopping street in Omagh, County Tyrone. About 100 people have been injured. It's the worst bomb attack in 30 years of terrorism in the province.
The bomb ripped out the heart of a town packed with shoppers and with people enjoying Omagh's annual Carnival Day. A warning of some 40 minutes was given that the bomb had been placed at the courthouse at one end of the main street. Police moved in to clear the area. People here say they were shepherded to the other end of the street, and that is where the bomb went off. Much of the main street was destroyed. The crowds took the full impact of the blast. In one moment, a bright Saturday afternoon became carnage and mayhem.
But the door for peace was opened via a landmark deal known as the Good Friday Agreement. People in Ireland will mark its 25th anniversary on Monday, tomorrow, the 10th of April. We can hear from three key players behind that agreement: the Irish Prime Minister at the time, Bertie Ahern, the former US President, Bill Clinton, and first, the then British Prime Minister, Tony Blair.
In these past few days, the irresistible force, the political will, has met the immovable object, the legacy of the past, and it has actually moved it. The idea that if one side wins something in Northern Ireland, the other loses is gone. The essence of what we have agreed is a choice. We are all winners or all losers. It is mutually assured benefit or mutually assured destruction here.
It will not be an easy task. Our shared past has left us with many bitter legacies. Thousands of people in Northern Ireland and in other parts have been the victims of all those decades of violence. We remember them this day. Others have suffered in many other ways, and we remember them too. But if the focus on these islands remains in the past will become the future, and that is something no one desires. And for that reason, we must dedicate ourselves to making this agreement work in its entirety.
After a 30-year winter of sectarian violence, Northern Ireland today has the promise of a springtime of peace. The agreement that has emerged from the Northern Ireland peace talks opens the way for the people there to build a society based on enduring peace, justice, and equality. The vision and commitment of the participants in the talks has made real the prayers for peace on both sides of the Atlantic and both sides of the peace line.
The voices of Tony Blair, Bertie Ahern and Bill Clinton. Well, over his 26 years at the BBC, Dennis Murray reported extensively on the peace process, including the pivotal moments that you've just heard, and he joins us live from Belfast. Dennis, good morning, welcome.
Good morning, Julian. Thank you very much. God, 26 years. That's all that.
I thought you'd appreciate that particular time reference. Take us back, not to the day itself, but I'm interested to know what began to fall into place to enable us to get to the stage where that peace agreement could be signed.
A lot of things did, and I could keep you here for the rest of the day explaining it, but to put it simply, that agreement was made by a lot of people who were mostly 40s and 50s. There were some younger ones and some older ones, but it was people who had spent all their adult lives living with the Troubles. I mean, Tony Blair, who you heard there a second or two ago, the then UK Prime Minister, he had had family holidays in Donegal, which is very far north in Ireland, but it's not part of Northern Ireland, that particular political entity. And he said he saw the sectarianism that isn't very common in County Donegal now, but there were shreds of it still left then. And he said, I asked him this many years later when devolution was finally established properly, and he said that was what got him interested in this whole subject. So it was people of about that age on all sides who decided that enough was enough of the violence and that something had to be done to get it stopped. And there were enough people in the right places on all sides to get it done.
Which is fascinating in the context of something we ran earlier in the programme, a group of people who are under 25, who never knew the violence, but are the sons and daughters of those who do.
Yeah. Well, people forget just how awful it was, really awful. A quick example, on last Thursday, my colleague and successor as BBC Ireland correspondent, Chris Page, did a piece for the news where he went back to his old school. He was 17 the day of the Good Friday Agreement. And one of his classmates was a young girl whose father was a member of the prison service in Northern Ireland, and he was murdered at their home when she was quite small by the IRA on my way home from doing some filming with Chris up at Stormont, which is where the Parliament is based, I got chatting with the taxi driver who told me his father had been murdered by a loyalist group, the Ulster Volunteer Force, in 1974 when he was 3. And I mean, how many people are there like that in a very small part of the world, even a small part of the United Kingdom? And there's an appalling legacy of that right across the society.